One day, Peter came to Jesus with a question about forgiveness. He asked, "Lord, how many times should I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times." Peter likely thought he was being generous, as forgiving someone 7 times seemed more than fair. Peter's question about forgiveness, found in Matthew 18:21-22, leads to one of Jesus' most profound teachings on the boundless nature of forgiveness. Peter, perhaps feeling generous, asks Jesus if forgiving someone up to 7 times would be enough. In the Jewish tradition, forgiving someone 3 times was considered a virtuous limit, so Peter's suggestion of 7 seems to imply a more magnanimous approach. However, Jesus responds by challenging this limit. "I do not say to you, up to 7 times, but 70 times 7. By this, Jesus does not intend for his followers to literally count up to 490 instances of forgiveness, but rather he emphasizes the need for forgiveness without keeping count. He calls for a forgiveness that mirrors God's infinite mercy, one that is willing to let go of bitterness again and again. To illustrate this, Jesus tells the parable of the unforgiving servant. In the parable, a servant who owes an insurmountable debt to his king is miraculously forgiven. However, this same servant, after being shown such extraordinary mercy, turns around and refuses to forgive a fellow servant who owes him a relatively small amount. When the king hears of the unforgiving servant's actions, he is angered and reverses the forgiveness, holding the servant accountable for his enormous debt. The parable reveals that just as God forgives us endlessly, we, too, are expected to forgive others with the same generosity. Forgiveness, according to Jesus, is not a matter of numbers but a way of life that brings healing, not only to the one forgiven, but also to the forgiver. The message is clear: by forgiving others, we participate in God's grace, freeing ourselves from the burden of resentment and offering others a chance at reconciliation. In his reply of 70 times 7, Jesus makes a powerful statement about forgiveness. Rather than setting an actual number, he intends to convey that forgiveness should be without limits, a continuous practice rather than a restricted quota. In the culture of the time, numbers held symbolic meaning, and 7 often represented completeness or perfection. By multiplying it further, Jesus amplifies the idea that forgiveness must be expansive and unbounded. This concept of limitless forgiveness turns societal expectations on their head. In Jesus' time, forgiving someone 3 times was already considered generous, and Peter's suggestion of 7 would have been viewed as going beyond the norm. But Jesus pushes even further, showing that God's forgiveness is immeasurable, and, as his followers, we are to emulate this divine mercy. Jesus calls his followers to a lifestyle where forgiveness is not transactional but transformative. Rather than harboring resentment or tallying offenses, we are encouraged to see forgiveness as a path to spiritual freedom and healing. Jesus' response reminds us that each act of forgiveness aligns us with God's own character, allowing us to share in his grace and release ourselves from the burden of bitterness. Through this practice of 70 times 7 forgiveness, we learn to let go, making space for reconciliation, peace, and a deeper connection to God's love. To further illustrate the lesson of unlimited forgiveness, Jesus tells the parable of the unforgiving servant. In this story, a king begins to settle his accounts, calling in servants who owe him various amounts. One servant, however, owes an astronomical debt, 10,000 talents, an amount so vast it could never realistically be repaid. This massive debt symbolizes the magnitude of what we owe to God, a debt beyond human capability to settle. When the servant realizes he cannot pay, the king initially orders that he, along with his family and possessions, be sold to recover a portion of the debt. Desperate, the servant falls to his knees, pleading for patience and promising to repay everything. Moved by compassion, the king does something extraordinary. He forgives the entire debt, wiping the slate clean. This act of mercy reflects God's heart. He is willing to forgive us completely, no matter how overwhelming our debt of sins may be. The king's forgiveness is not a calculated business decision. It's a grace-filled act, one that erases the servant's debt entirely. Yet, as the parable continues, Jesus reveals a deeper message about the nature of true forgiveness and the responsibility that comes with it. In the parable, the servant owes the king a staggering sum, 10,000 talents. To grasp the weight of this debt, it helps to know that a single talent was worth about 20 years' wages for an average worker. This debt, then, would take several lifetimes to repay, making it humanly impossible for the servant to ever clear what he owes. This unpayable debt illustrates the spiritual debt of sin that humanity owes to God, a debt so vast that no amount of good deeds or effort could ever settle it fully. When the king brings the servant forward to settle accounts, the servant faces a grim reality: he cannot pay what he owes. The king initially orders the servant and his family to be sold to recover a small fraction of the debt. This drastic measure highlights the severity of the situation, and the servant, realizing the hopelessness of his position, falls to his knees, begging for patience and promising to repay it all, though he knows he cannot. The king's response is remarkable. Rather than granting an extension or demanding a reduced payment, he forgives the debt entirely. This act of grace symbolizes God's limitless mercy. Just as the servant could never repay his monetary debt, we too could never earn our way to forgiveness. It is a gift from God, unearned and immeasurable. Through this parable, Jesus reveals that God's forgiveness of our sins is an act of pure grace, one that completely cancels a debt we could never repay on our own. When the servant pleads for mercy, the king responds not with punishment or partial forgiveness but with profound compassion. Moved by the servant's desperate plea, the king does the unimaginable: he cancels the entire debt. This act of mercy is a transformative moment in the parable, representing the boundless compassion of God. The king's forgiveness is a complete and reserved gift, erasing a debt so massive it would otherwise have defined the servant's life. The king's decision goes beyond mere leniency. It is a demonstration of grace in its purest form. He does not demand repayment plans or conditions, nor does he make any stipulations for future behavior. Instead, he simply forgives, setting the servant free from a burden he could never have lifted on his own. This forgiveness is a reminder that God's mercy doesn't come in measured doses. It's poured out fully, liberating us from the weight of sin and giving us the chance to start anew. The king's compassion invites us to reflect on how we can respond to others with similar mercy. Just as the servant's life was forever changed by the king's kindness, we too are called to extend forgiveness to those around us, mirroring the limitless grace that we ourselves have received. Jesus uses this moment in the parable to show that forgiveness is a reflection of God's own heart, a gift that heals, restores, and brings freedom. After being forgiven of his enormous debt, the servant encounters a fellow servant who owes him a relatively small amount, 100 denarii, roughly the wages for a few months' work. Unlike his own unpayable debt to the king, this sum is manageable and could be repaid over time. However, instead of extending the compassion he was shown, the forgiven servant seizes his fellow servant and demands immediate payment in full. The second servant, unable to pay at once, pleads for patience, using almost the same words the first servant had used with the king: "Have patience with me, and I will pay you." Yet, rather than showing mercy, the unforgiving servant has his fellow servant thrown into prison until he can pay the debt. This response is shocking and reveals the hardness of his heart. He has received extraordinary forgiveness but is unwilling to show even a fraction of that mercy to another. Jesus uses this part of the parable to illustrate a harsh truth: forgiveness should not end with us. It is meant to flow through us to others. The servant's failure to forgive his peers is a stark contrast to the king's compassion, highlighting how we are called to act as conduits of God's mercy. By refusing to forgive a smaller debt, after being forgiven of a massive one, the servant demonstrates a lack of gratitude and an inability to comprehend the grace he was shown. This scene also serves as a cautionary reminder that when we withhold forgiveness, we block the flow of mercy that God has freely extended to us. In the parable, the unforgiving servant's actions ultimately lead to consequences that underscore the seriousness with which God views forgiveness and compassion in our relationships. In the parable, The scene becomes increasingly tense as the unforgiving servant confronts his fellow servant over the debt. Despite the plea for patience and understanding, he remains resolute in his refusal to show mercy. The fellow servant, fully aware of the magnitude of his own predicament, can only beg for a second chance, just as the first servant had done with the king. However, instead of extending the grace he had just received, the unforgiving servant's heart hardens. His reaction is immediate and severe. Enraged by the request for more time, he seizes his fellow servant and has him thrown into prison. This act not only showcases his lack of empathy but also highlights the stark contrast between the mercy of the king and the unforgiving nature of the servant. While he himself was granted a fresh start, he chooses to perpetuate a cycle of debt and punishment, completely ignoring the lesson of grace he had just experienced. The imprisonment of the fellow servant serves a dual purpose. It reflects the unforgiving servant's failure to recognize the gift of mercy he had received, and foreshadows the consequences of his actions. By refusing to show compassion, he isolates himself, perpetuating a culture of unforgiveness that goes against the very nature of the king's original act of grace. The news of this unforgiving act spreads, reaching the king, who is both dismayed and angered by the servant's behavior. The king's forgiveness was meant to inspire gratitude and generosity, not to be met with cruelty and vindictiveness. This pivotal moment serves as a powerful reminder that with great grace comes great responsibility. We are called not just to receive forgiveness, but also to embody it in our interactions with others. In essence, the unforgiving servant's refusal to show mercy illustrates a tragic truth. Forgiveness is not just a one-time act, but a continuous posture of the heart. When we accept God's grace, we are invited to share that grace with others, cultivating an environment of love and mercy rather than judgment and condemnation. Jesus uses this parable to challenge his listeners to examine their own hearts and consider how they extend, or withhold, mercy in their lives. The unforgiving servant's harsh treatment of his fellow servant does not go unnoticed. Other servants, witnessing the scene unfold, are filled with outrage and disbelief at his lack of mercy. They are struck by the stark contrast between the king's compassionate act of forgiveness and the unforgiving servant's cruel response to a relatively minor debt. Their outrage is not just about the injustice they observe, it also reflects their understanding of the king's character and the expectations that come with receiving such grace. These other servants decide to take action. They report the unforgiving servant's behavior to the king, conveying not only what they witnessed but also their deep concern over the betrayal of the king's trust. Their report emphasizes the seriousness of the unforgiving servant's actions, highlighting that his refusal to extend mercy not only harms the fellow servant, but also disrespects the king's generous forgiveness. When the king hears of the unforgiving servant's actions, he is enraged. He had extended a monumental act of grace to this servant, expecting him to replicate that mercy in his dealings with others. The king's anger underscores a critical truth about forgiveness. It carries with it an obligation to reflect the character of the one who forgives. The king's response shows that mercy is not merely an abstract concept. It demands a practical outworking in how we treat those around us. In a powerful turn of events, the king summons the unforgiving servant. The confrontation is direct and charged with emotion. The king reminds him of the enormous debt he had forgiven, asking why he could not extend the same grace to his fellow servant. The king's disappointment is palpable. He expected that the forgiven servant would have been transformed by his experience of mercy, using it as a model for how to treat others. Instead, he finds someone who has failed to grasp the essence of the grace he received. This moment serves as a pivotal turning point in the parable, as the king's reaction to the unforgiving servant reflects God's own justice in response to those who refuse to show mercy after receiving it. It reinforces the idea that forgiveness is not only a gift but also a responsibility. The king's outrage signifies that withholding forgiveness can lead to dire consequences, a warning that reverberates through the generations. Jesus, through this narrative, emphasizes that true forgiveness is not just about receiving grace, but about actively living it out, demonstrating the transformative power of God's love in our relationships. The parable calls all who hear it to reflect on their own hearts and actions, urging them to embrace a spirit of forgiveness that mirrors the boundless mercy of God. As the king confronts the unforgiving servant, his disappointment quickly escalates into righteous anger. He condemns the servant as wicked, pointing out the grave injustice of his actions. The king, having shown immense compassion by forgiving a debt that was beyond measure, expected that the servant would demonstrate that same mercy toward others. Instead, the servant's actions reflect a heart hardened by pride and a lack of understanding of the grace he received. The king's judgment is not arbitrary. It is rooted in the principles of justice and mercy. He reminds the servant of the extraordinary forgiveness he had received, his enormous debt erased in an instant, and questions how he could possibly refuse to extend a fraction of that mercy to another. The king's words carry a weight of authority, illuminating the servant's failure to live out the transformative power of forgiveness. This moment reveals the expectation that comes with receiving grace. We are called to pass it on, sharing the mercy we have been given. In response to the unforgiving servant's actions, the king decides to revoke his previous forgiveness. He orders that the servant be handed over to the jailers until he can repay the entire debt. This punishment serves as a stark reminder of the consequences of unrepentant hearts. The king's decision to take back the forgiveness is not merely punitive. It underscores the seriousness of the servant's refusal to show compassion. The servant's inability to forgive has severed the very grace that had set him free, plunging him back into the debt he could never repay. This aspect of the story reflects a sobering truth about the nature of forgiveness. It requires a reciprocal relationship. Just as we are offered mercy, we must extend it to others. Failing to do so leads to spiritual consequences. The king's judgment highlights that the grace we receive from God carries an obligation to embody that grace in our interactions with others. As the parable concludes, Jesus emphasizes that God's forgiveness is not a license for us to act with indifference or cruelty. The fate of the unforgiving servant serves as a cautionary tale, illustrating that a heart that refuses to forgive cannot fully experience the transformative power of grace. Instead, it becomes trapped in bitterness and resentment, losing sight of the freedom that forgiveness brings. Through this narrative, Jesus calls his followers to examine their own hearts and attitudes toward forgiveness. The parable urges us to reflect on how we respond to those who wrong us, challenging us to let go of grudges and embrace the boundless mercy that God has extended to us. Ultimately, the king's judgment serves as a reminder that forgiveness is not just an act but a way of life that aligns our hearts with the very nature of God himself. As Jesus concludes the parable of the unforgiving servant, he drives home the profound lesson on forgiveness that permeates the entire story. The core message is clear. God expects us to forgive others in the same way that we have been forgiven. This expectation is not merely a suggestion, it is a directive rooted in the very nature of God's mercy and grace. Through the parable, Jesus highlights that forgiveness must come from a place of genuine compassion and heartfelt sincerity. It cannot be a superficial act or a mere obligation. Instead, it should be an authentic response to the grace we have received. Just as the king's forgiveness was unconditional and transformative, so too should our forgiveness toward others reflect that same depth of understanding and love. Jesus emphasizes that our capacity to forgive is tied to our recognition of how much we have been forgiven. When we grasp the enormity of our own debts, our shortcomings, failures, and sins, we begin to see others through the lens of grace. This perspective allows us to approach those who wrong us not with judgment or resentment, but with empathy and understanding. The act of forgiveness becomes a powerful expression of love, rooted in the awareness of our shared humanity and the struggles we all face. The parable also illustrates that withholding forgiveness can lead to spiritual bondage. Just as the unforgiving servant was imprisoned by his refusal to forgive, we too can find ourselves trapped in bitterness and resentment when we refuse to let go of past hurts. The refusal to extend grace can create a cycle of negativity that not only harms our relationships with others but also distances us from the love and peace that God desires for us. Furthermore, Jesus' teaching challenges societal norms that may condone grudges or limited forgiveness. Instead of viewing forgiveness as an act of weakness, Jesus frames it as an act of strength and obedience to God's will. It is a deliberate choice to release the burdens of anger and pain, allowing healing and restoration to take place, not just in the lives of those we forgive, but within our own hearts as well. In teaching this parable, Jesus invites his listeners, and us today, to reflect on our own practices of forgiveness. He urges us to consider whether our forgiveness is as generous as the king's, or if we are holding on to grudges like the unforgiving servant. The call to forgive is not an easy one. It often requires deep introspection and a willingness to confront our own pain. Yet, the promise is that genuine forgiveness leads to freedom, reconciliation, and an intimate relationship with God. Ultimately, the lesson of the parable resonates deeply with the heart of the gospel. God's love and grace are abundant, and we are called to mirror that love by extending forgiveness to others. As we embrace this teaching, we step into a life marked by peace, joy, and the transformative power of grace, reflecting the very essence of Christ's message of love and redemption. This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister from your heart. May your spiritual journey be filled with God's grace and peace. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video to inspire others on their walk with the Lord.